Colin Chapman. I'm the president of the AIIA here in New South Wales, and I'm your host tonight. And it's particularly pleasant for me to be able to welcome the Honourable Gareth Evans, whose record, I think, puts him as Australia's best and most distinguished foreign minister since World War II. And his role as foreign minister is only part of a very long career, about which you will hear more when one of our other guests introduces him as he delivers the Charterist lecture. And we also have with us a number of other special guests of the Institute tonight. His Excellency Pedro Delgado, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Canberra, who will actually introduce Professor Evans, and Ruth Pearce, Head of Public Policy and Information at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who's had a distinguished career as an ambassador in several places and run several important departments in DFAT. And John McCarthy, a renowned diplomat who is now the national president of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. And we welcome back here Dick Woolcott, who of course has been president of the Security Council when Australia last held that position, and of course was head of DFAT. And Dick, of course, is a member of the New South Wales chapter. And other guests with us tonight include two men who made their mark in the media. Mark Scott, the man managing the ABC at the moment, and Tom Switzer, the editor of the Australian Spectator and a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal. We welcome you all. Now, I should mention that beaming the lights at us from the back is the APAC channel, and so you'll be able to hear Professor Evans' speech again later in the week, and I'm sure you'll want to. Now, this is the 88th Charterist lecture, named after the man who founded the AIIA in Sydney as an outpost of Chatham House in London, at a time when Britain ruled the waves and Australian foreign policy was dictated by London. The year the AIIA was founded was, of course, the year when Professor Calvin Coolidge was on the US election trail and became president, and a time which was described as a huge tide of American conservatism. And he was a president who cut the immigration intake sharply in his second term of office. And at the same time, Ramsay MacDonald, in this year when the AIIA was founded, was elected as the first Labour Prime Minister in Britain and cut the defence budget. Does all this seem somewhat familiar? Now, in 1924, it would have been unthinkable to have an event like this in Sydney. Those kinds of things just didn't happen. And Professor Charteris would have been astonished at the number of Australian ambassadors that we have at our dinner in this room tonight. I'm not going to name them all, but I just want to tell you where they're all from. We have ambassadors who served in Accra, Amman, Bangkok, Delhi, Hanoi, Havana, Honiara, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Manila, Moscow, Mexico City, Singapore, Tokyo, at the United Nations in New York, Warsaw, Wellington, and Washington. This is a really formidable list, and we welcome you all here tonight, and it's very good for the many young people that are in this audience tonight to be able to mingle and mix with you and get the benefit of your experiences. Now, I'm not here to make a speech, I'm just here to welcome you all. I hope you enjoy your dinner. Unlike the last Charterist dinner when Kevin Rudd, the then Foreign Minister, spoke during the main course. We're going to let Gareth Evans enjoy dinner with us, and then he will be introduced to you as soon as the main course is finished. So thanks again for coming, and welcome to Tattersalls and to the AIIA Charterist Dinner.
Time here, so I think that it's a really great privilege for me to be introducing the Honourable Gareth Evans, AO QC, for which I am very thankful for the Institute, of course. The first question, obviously, is does Professor Evans need any introduction? Surely not to any of you. I presume the number of you attending tonight's event bear witness to just that. In fact, both you and me are here because we know that important things are going to be said tonight, and that we will all go out richer in ideas than when we came in. Mr. Evans has had a long and distinguished political career in Australia, as you know, more than 20 years long, and 13 of those as Cabinet Minister. He was Foreign Minister from 1988 to 1996. Momentous years for humankind, when change of an unimaginable scale swept the world, throwing away structures which prevailed from the end of the Second World War, and some indeed from the time of the First World War, structures that only a couple of years prior to 1989 would have seemed impervious to any change. He had the vision to seize the opportunity open at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall for non-proliferation, disarmament, and a safer world in general. These are matters that we may rightfully think that are to be settled by the big guys on the block. But medium-sized powers can play a role in bringing ideas to the table, coming up with creative and achievable solutions and convincing the main actors that it is in their world's and their own best interest to yield and thus pushing the envelope on the margins to actually make things happen. It takes will and determination, and as an observer and practitioner of that very agenda in those years, I can say that the role that Australia played through the endeavours of its then Foreign Minister Evans in the conclusion of the long-negotiated Convention on the banning of chemical weapons and the creation of OPCW, in the process to strengthen nuclear safeguards at the IAEA through what was then called 93+2, that then ended up in the additional protocol, or in those leading to the adoption of the CTBC later, was nothing short but remarkable. He also had a crucial role in developing the UN peace plan for Cambodia, no mean achievement, and in the creation of APEC as Foreign Minister in the Keating government. I was a young diplomat when Mr. Evans was Foreign Minister, and I did not engage with him directly. I could not gauge exactly how Australia became all of a sudden much more active internationally. I thought it was because the undisputed quality of our diplomatic colleagues of DFAT, many of whom are present here today, which is something that I have to admit, and in my career, my first posting were 8 years in the mission to the UN, having the pleasure to sitting next to Australia, and I hope next year we will sit together at the Security Council. But it is clear to me now that this driving force, there was a driving force behind these changes and this impetus, and certainly Minister Evans was that driving force. He then, when he left the Foreign Ministry, he led the International Crisis Group from 2000 to 2009, one of the most important and influential global independent organizations for conflict prevention and resolution, which publishes some of the best papers you can find anywhere on diverse regions. He co-chaired the Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which led nothing less than to the responsibility to protect, one of the most groundbreaking concepts for the protection of human rights and indeed of human beings developed in the last 2 decades, one by which the sacrosanct notion that the state sovereignty yields to the need to protect peoples. Foreign Policy magazine cited him among the top 100 global thinkers for 2011 for making the responsibility to protect more than academic. As I understand, Mr. Evans was actively involved in issues relating to human rights and civil liberties in his days as a university student. He also co-chaired recently the International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, which produced the report Eliminating Nuclear Threats, another crucial document published at the end of 2009. I did most of my career dealing with this matter, so I'm particularly attached to that. He is now Chancellor of the Australian National University, which obviously links him very closely to us diplomats based in Canberra, and also Professional Fellow at the University of Melbourne. He has written or edited several books and is a prolific author on papers and comments. It would be impossible for me to refer even to a fraction of them here. The number of things that Dr. Evans, Professor Evans, and Foreign Minister Evans have done is really huge. I very recently heard someone in Canberra referring to him as a force of nature. And, and I have to say that in the fields of ideas and foreign affairs, he is indeed one, and very much for the good. When people talk about being a creative middle power, you can say that there are very few chances to be more creative than when Senator Evans was Foreign Minister of Australia. The notion of niche diplomacy comes here. We are therefore up for a very good presentation, for lots of food for thought, and that will, I hope, stimulate good debate. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Gareth Evans.
Well, thank you, Pedro, for that impossibly generous introduction, which is going to be inconceivably difficult to live up to, not least in the presence of so many friends, colleagues, mentors, critics, harassers, haranguers, and otherwise friends in the audience tonight. But wonderful to see you all, and thanks so much for inviting me to be with you. As they get older, forces of nature or otherwise, some people get more cantankerous, and others get rather more mellow. I think I'm generally in the latter category, although I have to acknowledge that becoming a complete model of Buddhist tranquility has proved to be a rather hard slog. Some things do unquestionably still have the capacity to stir my blood. And very high on that list is any talking down of Australia as a country not capable of making any kind of significant contribution to the wider world of international affairs. I saw a notable example of this genre in a piece a week or two ago by a local academic blogger who shall remain deservedly nameless. It described Australia as a country of no power, no influence, for the most part invisible in international politics, whose bid for a Security Council seat is a vainglorious project likely to fail, or if it succeeds, do no more than open up, like our overseas missions generally, job opportunities for, quote, the corpses of failed politicians, careerist bureaucrats, and, unkindest cut of all, irritating former cabinet ministers. You won't be surprised to hear that I think that I have a rather different view of Australia's capability and relevance. You may, of course, take the position, as Mandy Bryce-Davis famously did during the Profumo affair in commenting on someone's denial of an improper relationship. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? My wife said to me last night, at least that line should cast some sort of resonance with the demographic you'll be talking to tonight. But it's the nature and extent of Australia's capability and the role that it will play in meeting the challenges and setting priorities for our foreign policy in the decades ahead that I thought it might be useful to talk about this evening. We should begin by reminding ourselves of a few objective facts that go to our standing and reputation. We are, by most measures, the 12th largest economy in the world. By any measure, we're the third largest maritime zone and the 6th largest country by landmass. We're one of the most multicultural countries in the globe. We have a strong commitment to our Indigenous people, as the whole world applauded with our apology to the stolen generation. We bring to the table a unique geopolitical perspective, bridging our European history and our Asia-Pacific geography. Australians working in international organisations, both official and non-governmental, and Australian peacekeepers have won almost universally outstanding reputations. We've had strong and long-standing commitments to a rule-based global and regional order, and we've had a long, if not totally unbroken, record of demonstrated national commitment to the United Nations system in all its security, social and economic justice and human rights dimensions. Beyond that, we've been seen for many decades as a creative middle power with global interests and a long, if not again unbroken, record on both sides of politics of active and effective diplomacy on global and regional as well as bilateral issues. Not that both sides of politics have embraced with equal fervour the notion of Australia being a middle power. When the Conservative government of John Howard was in office from 1996 to 2007, middle power language was explicitly rejected, disappeared entirely from our diplomatic vocabulary. For Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, we were a pivotal power, and it was demeaning to suggest otherwise. As he put it on one occasion, my predecessor, Gareth Evans, talked about Australia as a middle power, and Labor seems to have a middle child complex when it comes to our place in the world. We're not middling or average or insignificant. We're a considerable power and a significant country. Well, I fear that my distinguished and very long-serving successor may have missed the point here. Perhaps, although I wouldn't wish to appear churlish, not for the only time in his ministerial career. In international parlance, the point is that middle powers has no connotation at all of mediocrity or insignificance. And I think Pedro, for one, would agree with me. The initial lists of middle powers that started appearing in the 1980s in fact tended to incorporate countries like China, France, the UK and Japan, with the top group containing only the great powers of the day, namely the United States and the Soviet Union. These days, the term is used not so much to describe countries by reference to their comparative population sizes or GDPs or military budgets. There's no generally agreed list, long or short, of those who, by some agreed objective measures, are neither great nor small. Rather, the term middle power is commonly used to describe the kind of diplomacy typically practiced by a relatively small and quite distinctive group of states. Australia, Canada, Scandinavian countries typically listed among them, although for all of us, commitment to this style of diplomacy has rather waxed and waned with changing political leaderships. I define middle power diplomacy as the kind of diplomacy which can and should be practiced by states who may not be big or strong enough, either in their own region or in the wider world, to impose their policy preferences on anyone else, but who do recognise that there are international policy tasks which need to be accomplished in the world around them, if the world around them is to be safer, saner, more just, more prosperous, with all the potential that this has in turn to affect their own interests, and who have sufficient capacity and credibility to be able to advance those tasks. Middle power diplomacy has a characteristic method and a characteristic motivation. The characteristic method of middle power diplomacy is coalition building with like-minded countries, usually also involving niche diplomacy, which simply means concentrating resources in specific areas best able to generate returns worth having rather than trying to cover the field. The concept of like-mindedness has really been changing in quite interesting ways. In the past, the countries in whose company Australia certainly felt more comfortable were those sharing the abiding values of Western liberal democracy, the living standards of the advanced industrial countries, and preferably speaking English as well. For leaders like John Howard and Tony Abbott, with their recurring references to the Anglosphere, it's not entirely clear that the present has eclipsed the past. But these days, the term like-minded much more often describes those who, whatever their prevailing value systems, share specific interests and are prepared to work together to do something about them. In an age where the whole world is preoccupied with that group of transnational or global public goods problem issues that Kofi Annan once memorably described as problems without passports, from climate change to health pandemics to catastrophic human rights violations to terrorism to weapons of proliferation and the like, many more interests are seen as shared than was the case before, and many more countries are seen by most, if not all of us, as potential allies in cooperating to protect and advance them. The characteristic motivation for middle power diplomacy is what I've long, perhaps rather idiosyncratically, described as good international citizenship, another term which disappeared entirely from the Australian diplomatic lexicon during the Howard era, but which has had something of a minor rebirth under Foreign Ministers Rudd and Carr. The idea here, this is a belief in the utility and the necessity of acting cooperatively with others in solving international problems, particularly those problems which by their nature can't be solved by any country acting alone, however big and powerful. The crucial point to appreciate about good international citizenship is that this is not something separate and distinct from the pursuit of national interest. It's not some kind of foreign policy equivalent of Boy Scout good deeds. On the contrary, being and being seen to be good international citizens should itself be seen as a third category of national interest, right up there alongside the traditional duo of security and economic interests. The argument, as some of you have heard me trying to spell it out before, the argument is that by being seriously committed to cooperative international problem solving, national interest is actually advanced in two very different but very clear ways. First, through simple reciprocity. My help for you today in solving your drugs and terrorism problem might reasonably lead you to be more willing tomorrow to help solve my environmental problem. Secondly, through reputational benefit. The perception of being a country willing to take principled stands for other than immediately, narrowly self-interested reasons does no harm at all to one's own commercial and wider political agendas. One of the attractions of this concept is that it does bridge the traditional gap between realism and idealism by making it clear that pursuing values and interests are not necessarily completely different ways of doing things. Rather, the pursuit of values can also be the pursuit of interests. In confronting the main challenges, then, that lie ahead for Australian foreign policy, while some of them might at first sight seem to be more bilateral in character than the kind of multilateral issue which the concept of middle power diplomacy is primarily designed to address, I actually think that we'd be very well served by keeping that concept and the basic style of diplomacy that it entails very much in the forefront of our minds. I'm reinforced in that view, I have to say, by the very excellent address given to the ACT branch of the AIAA last month by Alan Gyngell, a consummate diplomat who I first got to know when he was Prime Minister Keating's foreign policy advisor, who became, as you'll all remember, the first director of the Lowy Institute and is now Director General of the Office of National Assessments. I'll have to speak to him a little severely about his apparent inclination in that address to treat interests and values as being in rather different diplomatic universes, but on everything else, his presentation, and I apply here the Benjamin Disraeli principle that my idea of an agreeable person is someone who agrees with me, I find him very agreeable indeed. Drawing on examples like the Cambodian peace plan exercise of 1989 to 93, the Australian contribution of the Howard government to the resolution of the East Timor turmoil in 1999, and the very important role that we played in 2008-09 in establishing the G20 as the main coordinating forum for discussion of the global economy, Alan Gyngell argues that Australian diplomacy has been at its most successful when, among other things, it's driven by the active engagement of ministers, uses our alliance relationships constructively, utilises effectively our long record of participation in multilateral organisations, and builds external coalitions, especially with the region. So in the context of the new regional and global dynamics of what, as Paul Keating might put it, every galah and every pet shop in the country is now calling the Asian century, and God knows we miss Paul's turn of phrase these days. In that context, I describe the biggest challenges and priorities for Australian foreign policy in the decades ahead as being fourfold. First, to avoid a zero-sum game developing in our relations with China and the US. Secondly, to get right and to keep right our relationship with India. Thirdly, to get right and to keep right our relationship with Indonesia. And finally, to win and to keep a place at the table at the major policy-making forums of the age, both regional and global. So a few words on each of those. First of all, avoiding a zero-sum game, choosing between China and the US. It hardly needs spelling out to this audience how much Australia would suffer if the relationship between far and away our most important economic partner and far and away our most important security partner were to end in tears. The bilateral relationship between the US and China is actually in reasonable shape at the moment, surviving some pretty sharp exchanges in 2010 on a number of provocative actions by China, South China Sea in particular, territorial issues, surviving also, obviously, without too much fuss, the recent tension over US support for the blind dissident Chen Guangchen. And of course, it will, for the foreseeable future, be held in check by the realisation that both countries are joined at the wallet. But there still remains the huge underlying issue of how the United States will respond over time to the dramatic acceleration in China's economic growth and all the stretching of wings, not least in rapidly increasing military capability, that is going with that. In terms of our relations with China, China is hard-headedly realistic about our alliance relationship with the US. In no doubt at all as to which side we'd be on if the nightmare scenario of a military confrontation were ever to arise. Conscious of the difference between hedging against a possible scenario and talking up a threat, and not inclined to let defence issues inhibit the other dimensions of its relationship with us. But all that said, it is important for us to show some reciprocal understanding and constraint of our own, to not push things too far, and to do our best to persuade the US and our other friends in the region to do likewise. As Australia gears up now for another defence white paper next year with all the potential for misunderstanding that we know can be associated with these documents, it really is very crucial that we work hard at every possible level to build an effective working relationship with China, economically, politically, and also on those global public goods issues, including multilateral arms control, about which I've spoken in the context of good international citizenship, to counter any perception that we are creeping back, edging back into the containment business. With the US, I think the most useful contribution we can probably make is to constantly urge our friends not only to not use the C word, containment, about which they don't really need any persuasion, but not to use either the, what I call the DLP words, maintaining the dominance or the leadership or the primacy of the United States and its allies in the region, about which perhaps a little more acknowledgement on occasion seems necessary. But most what's involved and what's likely in practice to be able to be delivered is the B word, balance. It's not always easy for Australia's voice to be heard in the halls of Westminster and Beijing. I certainly wouldn't wish to exaggerate our influence, or for that matter, anyone else's influence there. But what I've always found amplifies that voice is when we're perceived as a useful player, as an active middle power with coalition building and policy delivery capability of our own in advancing objectives which these great powers need from time to time help to achieve. The paradigm example for me of that has always been the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1992, which the United States, like many others, wanted, and which Australia's engagement was actually quite crucial in delivering. As then Secretary of State Jim Baker said to me at the time in almost these words, Washington needed to make the running someone who wouldn't frighten the horses. Second priority, to get right and keep right our relationship with India. The rise of India is becoming a visibly important phenomenon to all of us as that of China, but the India-Australia relationship still has, as John McCarthy will know, a very long way to go to achieve the weight and priority that it should have, despite his and many others' best endeavours. It's one that has not been terribly good at taking the small bumps in its stride, as a genuinely mature relationship does, and it continues to take a very long time for policymakers and publics to get their heads past the stereotypical 3 Cs, cricket, curry, Commonwealth. The environment for forward movement has been created with the removal last year of the uranium ban, which I, for one, accept that there was absolutely no point in maintaining once the wider international community had sold the pass on that issue. The way forward is for both India and Australia to focus on their respective national interests, to rethink what these mean in the new economic and geopolitical environment of the Asian century, and to recognise that they can be very usefully enhanced by consciously trying to develop some new and enhanced dimensions to that relationship. There are some obvious places to start, certainly in the burgeoning economic relationship, which is already happening, with a comprehensive liberalising trade agreement of the kind that's now begun to be negotiated. And in the defence and security area, with some really serious efforts at maritime security cooperation to strengthen the level of naval engagement, both in the Indian Ocean region and in our Southeast Asian neighbourhood, aiming at addressing transnational seaborne challenges like piracy, people smuggling, and to developing further disaster management capability. The remaining area where it might be possible and would certainly be desirable to introduce a new level of maturity into India-Australia relations is in relation to our respective national interests in, again, being and being seen to be good international citizens. Maritime cooperation of the kind that I just mentioned is one such area, but there are a couple of others worth very quickly considering. The first is the global response to internal mass atrocity crimes, which has made a lot of progress in the last decade with the emergence, as Pedro kindly acknowledged, of the responsibility to protect concept, but is struggling for traction now in Syria after profound disagreements last year on the handling of the intervention in Libya. There's a critical need now to generate a new consensus as to when the sharp end of responsibility to protect, namely coercive military force, might be legitimately authorised and implemented in these situations. And this seems to me to be exactly the kind of improving global public goods campaign on which India and Australia could cooperatively work. The other area I can't help but mention is nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. India and Australia have long been prominent and articulate supporters of both, but differences of view about basic strategy, particularly since India itself acquired the bomb in '98, have obviously made it very difficult to find constructive common ground. With the uranium issue now behind us, it may be possible for us to work together to fundamentally advance the agenda, to which I believe we're both committed, of a nuclear weapons-free world, exploring again in that context at least some of the areas in which India might actually play a leadership role, starting with the ratification, without waiting for the US and China, of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The third priority I mentioned is to get right and keep right our relationship with Indonesia. One of the many enduring mysteries of Australian public policy is why Indonesia simply hasn't, with only a few honourable exceptions, attracted the same level of attention and understanding and high-level commitment, sustained commitment, from our political leaders that other Asian countries have received, and which it so manifestly deserves. Most people seem to constantly forget, despite the urging of so many of us, that Indonesia is both the fourth largest country in the world and the largest Islamic country in the world, and is by far the biggest and most potentially influential player in ASEAN, albeit in a lot of its history it's largely punched below that weight. A big part of the reason we all know why a multi-dimensional relationship hasn't really taken off, at least on the Australian side, is the old stereotypical habits of thinking about Indonesia, which really haven't changed very much. That it's all still thought of as a military-dominated, authoritarian, undemocratic country, hostage to Islamic terrorist fortune and with an exotic institutional governance culture. But the short point to make is that this audience won't need any persuasion that stereotype is now completely outdated. There has occurred a fundamental democratic transformation in Indonesia, which is in the process of fundamentally changing the old governmental culture, and which is critical now. It's critical now that we and the rest of the world recognise, applaud, and do our best to help consolidate. There are multiple ways in which we can add bilateral ballast to that relationship, and most of them, as with India and China, are very squarely in the sights of Ken Henry and his white paper team. But I can't help but remember the way in which the extraordinarily productive, cooperative relationship that I developed as Foreign Minister with my counterpart Ali Alatas in a number of played back into and very significantly consolidated the then extremely fragile bilateral relationship between us. We have actually now, in the present Indonesian Foreign Minister, Marty Natalegawa, someone who spent his formative years throwing the Age newspaper over Canberra front fences to help support himself as a student at the ANU. And we ought to be leveraging that personal connection into a much more comprehensive effort to develop with Indonesia like-minded, middle-power, niche diplomacy initiatives across a whole range of global public policy, global public goods issues. All the building blocks have been laid for that kind of cooperation, including as fellow members of the G20 and as groups like Friends of the Responsibility to Protect in New York. It just takes the will, the persistence to see that through. Fourth and finally, the priority, the objective, winning and keeping a place at the table in the major policy-making forums of the age, both regional and global. Australia's worked very hard, and rightly so, over the last couple of decades to put in place regional economic and security mechanisms from APEC and the ASEAN Regional Forum to the new East Asia Summit that actually work. To advance all our national interests, both broadly and narrowly framed, we unquestionably need effective dialogue and policy cooperation structures, with meeting deadlines, focusing policymakers, departmental minds, and the meetings themselves enabling the building of those very direct personal relationships at leadership level, which are always a crucial element in productive diplomacy, as so many of you here in this room will be acutely aware. We certainly don't need, in any of this, just another expensive series of photo opportunities with set-piece speeches endorsing lowest common denominator communiques. But at the same time, we should not expect too much too soon in the way of hard decision-making from these mechanisms. For all the impatience this occasionally generates in Australians like me, there is much to be said for our Southeast Asian colleagues' view that the great value of multilateral engagement is as a process through which trust and confidence can be built over time. Globally, we have right now two high institutional priorities. One is to develop the role of the G20, where Australia already has a seat at the table, along with all the world's major players. To develop it as an across-the-board global policy-making organisation, addressing a whole range of global public policy goods issues, and not just the core economic ones. Like almost everything else multilaterally, that's going to take time. But we did play a blinder with Kevin Rudd in 2008-09 in lifting the G20's game in response to the global financial crisis, and I believe we're not incapable of doing so again. The other and more immediate priority is our bid to win back, after an extraordinary 27 years of absence, that's what it'll be this year, a seat at the global table in the UN Security Council. Whatever the frog pond occupied by some well-known bloggers and press commentators and opposition leaders might be croaking, it's critical to appreciate that periodically taking a rotational seat at the apex of the global system for maintaining peace and security is not some kind of optional icing on the cake, likely in fact to be more trouble than it's worth, but absolutely in Australia's national interests, however conceived. Our troops operate in East Timor, Afghanistan, under Security Council mandate. The Security Council is the only body legally able to mandate the use of force, and it imposes sanctions that we're obliged to implement in North Korea, Iran and lots of other places. A country like Australia not only benefits from the global system, but has a responsibility in our own interests as well as everybody else's to ensure that it works effectively. We started late. Other deals have been done. It's not going to be easy to win that seat. And let's face it, if the Palestinian statehood issue should come to a vote in the General Assembly before October and the Prime Minister's current view prevails, it'll be impossible to win that seat. But both national interest and national pride demand that we try like hell to get there. My final word. I refuse to believe that Australia is just another also-ran country, focusing wholly on our own interests defined in the narrowest possible way, not really caring much about the wider world we live in, and deserving to be treated accordingly. I believe that, on the contrary, we are, and that our track record over many decades overwhelmingly shows it, a decent, committed group of international citizens, independent-minded, and also with a real attractive egalitarian streak as well, neither sucking up to the powerful nor kicking down at the powerless. Playing to that instinct of decency, focusing on cooperative problem solving, using all the energy and creativity that's traditionally been associated with Australian middle power diplomacy at its best, will be far and away the best way of ensuring in the years and the decades ahead, in a region and in a world in which the tectonic plates are shifting and every possible kind of uncertainty abounds, ensuring that this wonderful country of ours not only survives but thrives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for that challenging commentary on life today and Australia's role in the world today. Gareth is happy to answer questions, and I can assure you, unlike the questions in Parliament, he will answer them directly and in a forthright manner. So who would like to begin?
Okay.
Yes, please.
Gareth, can I ask you to expand a little bit on your dire warning about the vote on Palestine? What are we going to do, and why in the world is she doing it? Who's advising her? What is all this about? Can you explain?
I've got a pretty clear idea what the motivation is. I've got a pretty clear idea of what the commitment is at the moment, which is to say absolutely no to any suggestion of not only supporting statehood resolution but even just abstaining from it, which would be fine basically in terms of our Security Council candidacy. I don't want to speculate further or explain further why things are as they are, but what I do want to say is that I think it's a very wrong-headed approach from the point of view of Israel's own interest. I have a vivid memory of a conversation with Yitzhak Shamir, and some of you may have heard me describe. Yitzhak Rabin. Shamir was a different character. Rabin, 3 months before his assassination in Israel, in which I was in the course of haranguing with my usual chutzpah about what he ought to be doing to solve the Palestinian problem. Then I broke off midstream and I said, but of course I'm preaching to the converted. Rabin looked across at me and he said, "You're preaching to the committed, not the converted." And I think that got it exactly right. I mean, here was somebody who knew that Israel's interest, whatever his own Judea, Samaria, ideological baggage, and he had the lot, Israel's interest demanded a two-state solution and demanded the fastest possible tracking to that. And the great tragedy of the whole Israel-Palestinian affair is that he died and nobody since has showed remotely that same leadership understanding. Bob Hawke tried very hard when he was Australian Prime Minister to communicate to Jewish community, to communicate to Israel how much its interest depended on a quick, fast resolution, getting there to the two-state solution. Huge amounts of work's been done, including by my own international crisis group, in defining what the parameters of that solution might look like. All the elements are out there. We just have to get there, and anything, to my mind, which generates a bit more leverage to encourage that process is wholly to be encouraged. I cannot see it as in any way opposed to Israel's interest, but there are all sorts of people who are determined to see it otherwise. At the moment, the Prime Minister is one of them, and I'm afraid we're stuck as a result in that particular warp, unless something happens to change your mind. The only hope is that the issue won't come to a vote in the General Assembly this year, and there's every reason to think that it probably won't, because the Palestinians are spooked by the intensity of the US position of support for Israel on this and what that will mean in terms of flow of finance. They're spooked by the implications for what will happen in terms of complete collapse of Israeli support for the administrative and financial arrangements which keep the West Bank going, and that's sort of concentrated their minds a bit. So with a bit of luck, this issue won't come forward. But it's a bit of luck for us. It's not a bit of luck in terms of moving forward the resolution of that issue, which desperately needs a circuit breaker, and God knows where it's coming from.
Somebody on that table down there, I can't see you, but perhaps you'd identify yourself, and just down there.
Many people say the 21st century is the...
Many people say the 21st century is the Chinese century. How do you feel about Australia's policy towards China now? Australia's Chinese.
Look, I think it's in the right place, basically. We're obviously critically dependent on maintenance of the relationship in economic terms. That can't be at the expense of tossing overboard our willingness to raise with China difficult and delicate issues about human rights and so on, and I hope that we are able and willing to go on doing that, because China needs to hear that constantly, all the time, from people around the world. But it does mean, I think, we do have to be cautious about joining any kind of throng that creates a sense of containment, encirclement, a sense that China is being besieged in defence terms and that it can't act to protect its interests, including in blue water sea lanes, like any other power with the interest to protect. I think we have to recognise the reality. China's a very proud country, and it's not going to be very tolerant of these DLP assertions, as I've described them, which hopefully, again, will have some resonance to this demographic. Leadership, dominance, priority. I think use of this kind of language can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's very important to avoid it, very important to go down the path which Hugh White has mapped with varying degrees of credibility towards an approach which says, let's just recognise that this has got to be a century of balance. Look, I think the best approach to, and China understands that, and provided we work within those sort of parameters and don't push it in unacceptable ways, the relationship is perfectly capable of surviving without being forced into the zero-sum game choice. Some in this audience will have heard me quote it before, but let me say it again, because I think, to me, it still encapsulates exactly the kind of position that America should be taking towards China and that we should be encouraging the US to do. This was something I heard Bill Clinton say 10 years ago at a private gathering after he left the presidency, which I happened to be there in California. And what he said was, look, there are two choices that America faces as to the way in which we can use this great and unprecedented economic and military power that we have, this unique constellation of economic and military power. Choice number one is to use that to create a world in which we remain top dog on the global block in perpetuity, whatever the competition from China or anybody else. Choice number two is using that power to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global block. And I think that gets it exactly right. I mean, no American politician, Barack Obama or anybody else, can talk overtly, publicly in those sort of terms. But we have to recognise the reality China's aspirations, China's capacity, China's response to centuries of perceived humiliation, China's determination to be up there and out there as an absolutely major player. We shouldn't be spooked by it. We should react to it in an intelligent and rational way, as should the Americans. How much influence we're going to have from our corner in persuading two countries to look at each other in that way remains to be seen. But our voice can't do any harm, and I think there's every reason to believe it can have some cumulative effect if other voices are heard in the same way as well.
Jeff Miller, I think you had a question, former National Deputy Vice President.
Thanks. Actually, really, it's just a comment and follows on from what Gareth's just said. And last week at a meeting here at the New South Wales AIIA, we heard a Chinese professor of economics from Hong Kong, but who nevertheless was a member of the National People's Congress, say that China had two main abiding concerns, and one was security of supply of energy, and the other one, which surprised me to hear, was fear of a potential United States military blockade. And thinking about that, and then in the last few days hearing reports of Secretary Panetta's visit to Asian countries, in which he said on one occasion that the US was going to move the majority of its fleet to the Pacific with 6 carrier groups, always on station in the Pacific. And secondly, that the US was looking for a naval base in Vietnam. Made me think that, you know, the situation between the US and China in strategic terms was probably a bit more touchy than what we often think of it as. We think, oh, they'll manage. But I think we need to be a bit more alarmed about the potential for the groups in both countries, which think in military terms, to get something going which escalates beyond what perhaps the national governments in either case would want to see happen.
I think the key to the answer is what you said in your very last sentence, groups in each country. The beginning of wisdom in understanding what's going on in China at the moment, as it's always been in understanding what goes on in America, is to recognise the diversity of competing and contending interests that are at work. When you try to look at what exactly inspired the 2010 South China Sea adventurism, chest beating, that in turn generated a major reaction and sent moving some of the signals which resulted in the reciprocal signals that you've just described, when you analyse it, as the International Crisis Group has just done a couple of months ago in a very, very fascinating report, what you find is just a miscellany of different interests within the Chinese firmament, all pushing particular barrows. The Foreign Ministry, by and large, is cautious, internationalist, moderate, anxious to find solutions to these issues without pushing too many neurotic buttons. PLA, much more traditionally in that kind of corner. Resource industries in another corner with interests of their own, which they're very anxious to not prejudice and pursue in terms of access to oil deposits and so on, South China Sea. The littoral provinces in the south, the maritime agencies, which have got different lives of their own, although based in Beijing and not locally. So you've got 6, 8, 9, 10 different agencies, power centres all jostling. And it's no problem to understand under those circumstances why some signals can be sent that in turn generate reciprocal overreaction from other sources. Life is a pretty complex business, and we do well to understand that complexity. We do well to understand the fragility of the situation, not be too complacent about it. But overall, I do think cooler heads will prevail at the end of the day, as we've seen over the last 2 years since 2010 in South China Sea. And I think we'll see it over and over again in the future. I'm an optimist about this stuff. But the important thing is you don't become hostage to fortune by creating potentially self-fulfilling dynamics. And the rhetoric, not of containment, nobody's going to use that word, but the rhetoric of dominance, the rhetoric of primacy, the rhetoric of maintaining even leadership in the region, is rhetoric that's only heard one way in China and does tend to reinforce that nationalist sentiment and others within the system who are all too ready to grasp at those sorts of stimuli. So it's a very delicate exercise. But look, against all that, China understands perfectly well, it's very sophisticated, the concept of hedging against capability rather than making assumptions about intent. Of course, that's what militaries have done from time immemorial. That's what US is doing. That's what we're going to continue to do. Well, they're not spooked by that. But what they are spooked by is this overt articulation of sort of threat language, which basically is not justified by the objective evidence, even though there's bits and pieces of it when you push below the surface. So the beginning of wisdom here as elsewhere is understanding the complexity of the situation and not overreacting.
Now, you can all see us pretty well, but we can't actually see you. But I know there's a lady on table 9 who wanted to ask a question through here.
Thank you, Professor, for a really interesting address. Thank you, Professor, for the really interesting address. I was wondering what you thought about the responsibility to protect and how we can make the soft law work better in terms of what's happened in Syria recently.
Well, we've come a hell of a long way in the last 10 years. By the end of the 90s, it was a complete consensus-free zone internationally about how to deal with mass atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, major war crimes, as we saw with the disagreements or the indifference to Rwanda, Srebrenica, disagreements over Kosovo. What's happened over the last 10 years is that a new concept, which we had something to do, has emerged, which has changed the way in which people debate this issue, conceptualise it, articulate it, and respond in policy terms. Responsibility to protect. 3 dimensions. Primary responsibility is that of the sovereign state itself to protect its people from such crimes. Second responsibility is that of the wider international community to assist a state that's in a mood to be assisted to deal with such situations. Third layer of responsibility, that of the wider international community to react appropriately if a state is manifestly failing to protect its own people and catastrophe is imminent or occurring. That's now embraced in UN language, universally accepted. The problem is translating that into policy delivery in particular situations. And there's a real problem still at the sharp end. We thought we'd solved that problem with the Libyan resolutions in the Security Council last year. Textbook case of responding to an imminent, obvious catastrophe with, first of all, warnings, threats, first of all, sanctions, ICC, International Criminal Court, threats of prosecution, arms embargoes, and then, a few weeks later, bang, with military force being applied. The trouble is, even though that was a textbook case, it was a case that sort of got out of control as last year wore on. A very widespread view developed among a large section of the international community that the P3, that NATO had exceeded its mandate. The argument's a very complicated one and it'll take 5 minutes to go through the issues, and I won't. But just to say that the BRICS countries, Russia, China, Brazil, India, South Africa, all of whom were on the Security Council at the time, were not being mindlessly spoiling when they said, hey, we are not persuaded that a full-scale regime change, rebel supporting, arms embargo breaching, conduct of war was really necessary to protect the civilian population. We were capable of being persuaded about that, but we haven't been persuaded because you, the P3, have been so bloody arrogant in the way in which you grab the mandate, run with it, refuse to debate the issue further in Security Council. And that's where it sort of sits. Because of that, there was a very adverse reaction when the Syrian issue burst into life. Even though the Syrian situation very quickly became as bad as anything that was happening on the ground in Libya, you couldn't even last year get the Security Council to agree on a condemnatory resolution, let alone sanctions, let alone ICC, let alone arms embargo, let alone even thinking about the military option. Because they said, give these P3 characters an inch and they'll take a mile. The P3 response was to be very arrogant and say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? And, you know, the inherent spoilers. But what the P3 sort of forgot during that process was they really needed a majority vote in the Security Council if these principles were ever to be effectively applicable again. So that's where it's poised at the moment. We're getting there in terms of the responsibility to protect issue. The Brazilians Pedro's South American colleagues have come up with a concept which is being debated as we speak in the UN, will be much more over the next couple of months, the idea of responsibility while protecting, which is not challenging the core idea, but adding to it the notion that the Security Council has got to be a lot more persuasive in terms of focusing its mind on the criteria for the use of military force, the issue that I mentioned as something we could usefully take forward with our Indian colleagues. And the idea that the Security Council has to be willing to accept some kind of monitoring and review process in the actual implementation of these mandates. So that debate is going on. Unfortunately, it's all a bit too late to help the situation in Syria, and we've still got a situation of fundamental paralysis. But it doesn't mean that the concept is kaput. It doesn't mean that all this effort of the last decade has been wasted. There's a fantastically different atmosphere about there. There's always going to be realpolitik dimensions. There's a horrible realpolitik dimension at the moment with Russia's obvious strategic interests in Syria. There's also infinitely more complex dynamics on the ground in Syria which make, I think, the notion of any kind of military intervention almost certainly inconceivable, quite apart from the effect of question of whether it's deliverable. I think it's very, very difficult in principle to make the argument that more good than harm would be done by a military intervention. I think you're looking at full-scale catastrophic civil war. I think the only game in town is the diplomatic one. I think the only game is to really pile maximum pressure on the Russians to in turn put some pressure on the Assad regime to find a sort of a soft landing solution to this. I don't think that's beyond the realm of possibility since Hula, because the Russians have been shamed into much more accommodating private position than they're still articulating publicly. But it's a disastrous situation, obviously, and one that's deeply unhappy. But don't be spooked about the basic responsibility protect principle. We're a long way further advanced than we were a decade ago. There are always going to be nightmarish difficulty in applying it in the really hard cases at the really sharp end of the reaction spectrum.
One down here somewhere.
Sorry, does anyone want their dessert? Or please feel free to serve it, or I'm happy to shut up if you. You're cool, Cole.
Hi, that was a bit of a shock. Ian Murray is my name from the Export Council of Australia. Look, I'm just a humble trader, so we see life a little bit differently. I do share your comments about Indonesia, and it's a breath of bloody fresh air, to be honest with you, to hear someone say that Indonesia is on the agenda as well, except for just China and India, because 240 million people cannot be underestimated with one of the largest middle markets in the world and right next door to us. So I share your comments on that. The other comment I'd like to make is you talked about the 3 Cs. I wouldn't underestimate cricket when it comes to trading. I worked in Pakistan for a while and they thought I was heaven. I knew every cricketer in the Australian cricket team, at least they thought that anyway. But the question I wanted to ask is two things. First of all, you haven't mentioned APEC tonight. I know APEC's not in an official context an important body, but it is an important body for Australia because at the end of the day, from a trade point of view, pretty much all our export business is done in APEC. And the second point I wanted to make is, where do you talked about us being the 12th biggest economy in the world, which we're all very proud of, but from a marketing point of view, and I have a background in marketing, where do you see people, particularly in the APEC region, where do they see us? Do they see us as being that important, or is it just their own self-belief? And what can we do to try and generate a greater understanding of the importance of Australia in the world context? Because number 12 in the world, to be honest with you, is a pretty high-ranking position against a lot of European countries, but I don't think many people appreciate that at all.
Well, I do think they appreciate it in Asia. I think our standing in Asia, unless it's deteriorated pretty rapidly since I was working the traps, is higher than most of the, with respect to the multitude of European colleagues are here. And I think we're in pretty good shape. And I don't think we're just seen as a quarry. I do think we're seen as a support of a base for sophisticated educational service delivery and a whole variety of other things that we constantly talk about. It's going to require some pretty effective trade diplomacy, public diplomacy to keep getting that story out, but I'm not too spooked by that. I do think the story, to a large extent, sells itself, and we don't need to be too self-lacerating about that. What we do have to do is keep on getting good policy in place and pursuing that actively, assiduously, systematically. And, I don't want to sound partisan, but I mean that period when the Howard government just stopped looking at Asia. They realised towards the end of their term that was completely wrong-headed. But all that focus on the Anglosphere, going back to Europe, the Brits, the Americans, and just not really putting the yards into the Asian effort was, quite disastrously counterproductive. I think it was fixed by the end of their term, and the momentum has largely been sustained. But my God, we've got to do it. Look, on APEC, I was there at the foundation of APEC. I was one of those who put it together with Neil Blewett, who's here in the audience tonight. And we remember our aspirations that APEC would move quite rapidly from being a trade facilitation organisation to a genuine trade liberalisation organisation. The Bogor Declaration, 94, free trade, 2010, 2020, developing countries. All of this was a tremendous sense of momentum and opportunity. Now, APEC has delivered a lot, but it hasn't delivered as much as we hoped. And I do think, while not casting it aside from the alphabet soup of institutions that we need to continue to be focused on, I do think we need to realise that APEC has not lived up to the expectations and the hopes that many of us had of it, and that we're going to have to work a hell of a lot harder, including bringing India within its membership, which is missing at the moment, if APEC is going to be the primary vehicle, not only for trade liberalisation and for facilitation, but for the liberalisation which is absolutely still at the heart. The trouble is we're moving away from that multilateral trade approach. It's the spaghetti bowl of bilateral arrangements is getting more and more complex with each passing year, and that basic, very, very strong commitment to the core multilateral achievement is diminishing. So it's going to take some hard work. But the only reason I didn't mention it, I didn't want to bore you all with still more acronymphomania and my description of what was going on around the place. But it is important, and I'm with you on that.
Gareth, you haven't bored us. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm going to ask now Ruth Pearce to come up and propose a vote of thanks to you. Thank you very much from me. And then I'm going to ask John McCarthy to make some closing remarks.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Colin Chapman, Gareth Evans, the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, and I'd like just to refer particularly to Neil Blewett, our former Minister, and Mr Dick Wilcott, former Secretary. It is an honour for me on behalf of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, particularly Secretary Richardson, to give the vote of thanks to the AIIA and our special guest, Gareth Evans, for another special Charterist dinner. The AIIA is an essential DFAT partner, one of our most important and valued. It's been for many years preeminent in engaging all aspects of foreign policy. It plays a vital role in stimulating public interest in foreign policy challenges and priorities, global debate and discussion. Its commemoration tonight of its founder, Professor Charteris, demonstrates the power and influence of Australia's public diplomats. I'm at the moment involved in the white paper on the Australia's risks and opportunities in the Asian century, and I'm particularly focused on public diplomacy. And it's very, very significant, the shift away from conventional diplomacy to what we call people-to-people diplomacy, and partners such as the AIIA are really crucial in the government, Australia being able to promote and protect its vital national interests. And our guest speaker, Gareth Evans, continues his dynamic and innovative engagement on the international global agenda. From the Blue Book, and I was involved with Gareth, if he remembers, on the Blue Book, which was really a radical and innovative reform proposal on global governance. And much of it is still there to be taken up, and I think the challenges facing the UN, if they'd taken up the Blue Book, they wouldn't be there today. And now to the urgent challenges we face on the global governance front. So thank you, Gareth, for your presentation, and thank you, guests, for honouring this valuable tradition of the commemoration of Professor Chatteris. Thank you.
Well, this was actually something that I was going to say to allow you all to go home. I think it's going to be something I say to allow you all to have dessert. I really just would like to say a few personal comments about Gareth. Pedro said when Gareth became Foreign Minister, Australia became much more active internationally. And he wondered about the linkage between the two. Well, I can tell you, anybody who's spent 14 hours in an aeroplane on the way to Los Angeles sitting next to Gareth will know quite well why Australia became more active internationally. And I think I really appreciate what Colin said, that Gareth is the best Australian Foreign Minister since the Second World War. One could actually argue he's the second, he's Australia's best Foreign Minister since the First Fleet, if you think about it. Certainly since Federation. Absolutely no argument about it. But looking at what his achievements are, it's already been, I think, rehearsed by Pedro and others. They were actually very considerable. It was the most creative period that I've experienced in Australian foreign policy, and I'm sure my former colleagues from DFAT will say much the same. Now, looking at what those achievements were, I think three stand out to me personally. Others may have different views. One was the Cambodia Settlement, which I think we need to recall was really what closed off the final chapter of the Indochina Wars. People who were active in Australian foreign policy from the 60s to the 90s really will recall that much of our work was dominated by what was happening in Indochina, through from the French War to the beginning of the American War, finally the China War, which involved also Cambodia. But it was a huge part of our work. It was a huge part of, actually, Southeast Asian diplomacy. It really dominated it. And it was Gareth who was essentially the architect of the plan which finished with the whole Indochina saga. And that really is enormously important, I think, in our history. The second point that I'd mention, I think, is the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was really the only reform that went through the UN when a whole batch of reforms were considered about a decade ago. And it is really hugely important because it impinges on the concept of sovereignty. And in a day or in a time when we are increasingly experiencing wars, civil disturbance right around the world, it will, I think, increasingly become a concept which can be implemented. As Gareth said, it's one of these concepts that will always be hard to argue. There was always going to be some resistance to the application of responsibility to protect. But it is a change in international doctrine of really huge significance. The third point that I think Gareth emphasised a couple of times in his speech, and which you don't hear much of now, is this concept of good international citizenship. I think too readily now we tend, and this is really something that is throughout the foreign policy community in Australia, there is a tendency really to see interests only in terms of economics and security, forgetting the third concept, or the third interest, which Gareth outlined, good international citizenship. And he correctly pointed out this is actually not just about being good. This is not about morals or values, not only about that. Of course, it includes it. It is about a whole network of interactions which fall under the guise of what we do as international citizens, but which redound to our benefit as a country. And he articulated all that very well, and there's no point in my going through it again. But I think those three areas were enormous contributions to our country by Gareth, and I think I want to underline that. I think that's enough from me. These were the final concluding comments. You can go. We hope you're not going to go. You can have your dessert, and please talk to others, because this is really a lot of what the AIIA is about. It's about meeting other people who are interested in these issues. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Gareth, again. You've been a marvellous speaker. I should also mention, I was told this evening as I came in that there was an award to be presented, and I said, Gareth got that a couple of years ago. It can't be right. But I should just underline, it's one of these great big, crystal things that, really look like what you see in an Agatha Christie play, where, which is called The Blunt Instrument, and somebody gets hit over the head in the library. But it's it's pretty heavy. But I sort of, I'm afraid, said that can't be right. He was given that 2 or 3 years ago. Well, Gareth, we're going to slip it to you, if it's possible to slip it to you after, because I forgot all about it, and it wasn't brought up here, and it weighs a lot. But you are a fellow of the Australian Institute for International Affairs. You've been one for some time, and if it needs to be reiterated, I'm doing it now. So thank you very much.